You're live. You might be live. Okay, I put off making this video for a long time because I don't know. I guess I thought some of the other ones would kind of catch on and hasn't really happened. I really want to make a. Originally, I was really going to make a part two to that. It's only a movie one because I had written down a lot of movies that I wanted to just talk about as in terms of their importance or cultural significance or whatever. But I was recently watching a video about uh, a particular song, really, and then the current common belief was that this Credence Clearwater "Fortunate Son" had been used in like every Vietnam movie ever, when actually it's only been in Forrest Gump. Like they had two songs in Forrest Gump, and those songs aren't in any. There might be in some TV shows or some other video games or things I don't know since, but like if you go back to, and here I'm gonna do the list so that you can get a timeline, an accurate timeline. Because when I did the last war movie roundup, I forget how much of this I included. But anyway, this movie takes place. Platoon takes place before that song even comes out. And some movies have kind of skirted, like, oh, and they throw in that song anyway because it's emblematic of the period or whatever. And on the soundtrack, Oliver Stone included like "Hello, I Love You," which came out a little bit after, and Otis Redding, which came out like the same week as like Platoon ends or whatever. So, would these guys have even heard either of those songs? No, but they're on the soundtrack, but they're not in the movie. Well, the Otis Redding one, I think it might be in like a tiny bit in the one part of the movie. I forget, but it's not relevant anyway. Because again, okay, for those of you who are new here, who've not watched, these are not movie reviews. This is meant to be a writing tutorial lecture, but I have to dip into all this other stuff and assume that the viewer hasn't, maybe you've seen the movies or heard of them, but you don't have a ton of knowledge of every single whatever that came out. Okay, so obviously the big ones, right? Going back a decade, more than a decade, we had MASH in 1970, Kelly's Heroes in 1970, and Catch 22 in 1970. All of those very kind of satirical, set in World War II, very not anti-military so much as poking fun at the military a bit, or the bureaucracy of the military. I think would be a better way to say it. And we do get glimpses of that maybe in Platoon in a much darker manner. But then in 1970 we also have Patton, right, which is well, Kelly's Heroes was very kind of gritty in spots. Patton, gritty in spots, right? We're transitioning into that anti-hero post-Italian Western period. The war movies aren't he got me and anymore, like you know what I mean, like the violence is starting to look a lot more like accurate. The locations are we're shooting on location for these things now. And then skip ahead, I'm not sure. Well, obviously, we skip ahead to 1978. Like I said, I don't know how comprehensive this list is, but I'm trying just to hit kind of the big ones that I definitely knew of when I was young, like even before high school or around that age, before even necessarily Platoon came out. So we have Boys in Company C in 1978, Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now both came out in 1979. Now these, obviously, I didn't see in the theater, but they were on TV a lot. And so you didn't necessarily see the whole thing all the way through. They were broken up over 2 days. There was commercials. there was, interruptions with homework or your parents or who knows what, but most people of like Generation X were familiar with these movies. And so when they both get referenced in Jarhead, that was another movie that came up in that other conversation where I think, some people might come over here from there by chance or by luck. Jarhead, kind of references, it doesn't reference Platoon specifically, but it exists in a similar parallel in terms of like story or whatever. I don't get too intellectual about these things, but we'll get there. Then we kind of switched gears in the early 80s with more. Well, we have First Blood. That's like an important one in 1982. And then unrelated to that originally, or maybe they were in the works at the same time, I'm not sure. But then we had the MIA POW movies, like Chuck Norris and Uncommon Valor, I think both came out in 83. And then Rambo came out the following year, I think. I think Rambo was 84 or 85 even. So those other movies already existed, and then Rambo kind of became the popular one, the really popular one, right? Even more, like I said, than I think Chuck Norris. Then you have the guy who wrote Patton coming back, and the guy who wrote Apocalypse Now coming back, Elias doing Red Dawn in 84, which is now we flipped the movie to the Russians are invading America, the communist Cubans and the Russians have teamed up and they've managed to infiltrate the heartland, and the teenage guerrillas have to step up and fight them back. And now the tables have turned, almost more like Afghanistan maybe than Vietnam, who knows. But then famously in a documentary, somebody mentioned like how Top Gun was the biggest movie the summer of 86. And everybody was all, yeah, rah, rah. But then Platoon comes out at Christmas and the mood totally changes. But Heartbreak Ridge also came out in 86, which, is a thing, right? But Platoon is the one, like Heartbreak Ridge is going along more. It's Clint Eastwood, so he's anti-hero, but he's also like the man, right? He's got to turn the rebellious, raw guys into the good soldiers. So we've gone back to a couple that I skipped because I talked about them in the Top Gun video, I think more. The Officer and Gentleman, which came out in 82, right, where the grungy guy from the streets is going to become a career pilot, and how's that going to happen? So yeah, I went a little bit out of order here, and more importantly, maybe to a degree, in terms of this discussion, because again, we're talking about the liberal take on things from the Hollywood perspective, more than we're talking about the soldier take on things, like maybe from more of the Clint Eastwood perspective, if that makes sense. There's kind of a schism there, yes. Apocalypse Now, like people can watch it and feel all rah, 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 but it's still an anti-war movie and based on reality-ish, but also based on everybody involved just being on a lot of, substances at the time, and how realistic it actually is in terms of, they got real helicopters and real boats and things, but it's also kind of a pretty lame movie in hindsight. It's less likely to get the rewrite treatment that, I would usually do with some others. But like I saw part of a movie that, I guess, that they were trying to redo When Harry Met Sally with a horrible cast and lame jokes. So my brain got sidetracked and I never wrote it out. But that's kind of a long-winded way to talk. But then going back again, Taps came out in 1981. And this was kind of an odd one because, Tom Cruise plays the crazy gun guy, and Sean Penn plays the level-headed best friend. But it's a total kind of, hippie take on, war kills everybody and guns can go off by themselves. And same as Officer and Gentleman, the townies hate all the soldiers because they're warmongers and they take all the women or whatever. I don't know what, necessarily really goes on in college towns or military, in TAPS. Like I said, it's very parallel to Officer and a Gentleman, and actually came out first. But there's a lot of parallels in these two movies. But in real life, those people in those neighborhoods, those townies have the brothers who served, or they also served themselves. And that element gets kind of lost when, in reality, the returning veterans were getting the resistance from the liberals, not the conservatives, right? And so there's kind of a schism here by the time the 80s roll around as to how they're presenting, who was actually fighting with these returning soldiers and all that. So yeah, I know it's taking a long time to actually talk about Platoon, but that's what. Like I said, you have a whole decade of war movies before, and even more than that, really, if you want to extend back to, like I said, these anti-hero kind of ones where we're presenting. It's not John Wayne landing, in Normandy and saving the world, or whatever the World War II movie narrative, supposedly always was, or whatever. And then, of course, after that, it devolves into Best Defense, which I saw it and I couldn't tell you a thing that happens in it anymore. It's, considered one of the worst movies of the 80s. But then also Spies Like Us. So back to Afghanistan. But again, another total comedy. And I forget what year those came out. Around 86, maybe 85. And then after that, you get in 87 or 88, somewhere in there, it's Hamburger Hill and Full Metal Jacket. And I'm not going to talk about those, at all. So in Platoon, I mean, like I said, we're Taps and Platoon. There's some parallels, I guess. I mean, because in the one, you have Timothy Hutton, he's patriotic and he wants to be there. He's a little more like Ron Kovic in Born on the 4th of July, maybe. Whereas in Platoon, we don't have a character who's necessarily very patriotic. He gives reasons for why he wanted to enlist, why he wants to go to the war. And, maybe he's leaving out some aspects, but he just says, I'm well off, and why should only the poor kids have to go fight? And then they joke about it, and say, oh, we got ourselves a crusader, right? And they do kind of delve into civil rights issues without mentioning any, there's a lot of talk about discrimination and this and that. I'll get into some of that. But they don't really get too political for most of it. But they don't talk about anything positive that happened either, because this movie takes place at the end of 1967. Well, Lyndon Johnson's already signed, 2 civil rights acts or whatever by then. But these guys aren't arguing about that stuff. They're trying to figure out how to stay alive and all that, right? So, he goes from this kind of college thought processes, and he never really interacts with the other college. Like the lieutenant is, a college guy. Maybe they would be at kind of a similar Ivy League school, but he never interacts with the lieutenant at all. And as an enlisted man and a buck private, you likely wouldn't very much. But the lieutenant makes the rounds and he kind of says hi to the guys in the one bunker, but he doesn't go into the other bunker or whatever. So Charlie Sheen hangs out with Elias a little bit. Charlie Sheen, Chris Taylor. Like we're worried about this from a writing perspective, not a character analysis perspective, anyway. But and in fact, before I lose my train of thought entirely, it's kind of hard to discuss this movie or these kind of movies on this type of platform with all the socio-political themes and foul language, because I can't. Like, I've seen videos where other people use direct language, but I don't want to get, pulled off the platform on a technicality for, what's not a discussion about those things, But I can't really use a lot of direct quotes from the movies and things. But so yeah, Chris Taylor you know, he's dropped into this environment where he's dealing with guys who are not college thought philosophy guys or whatever. They're just, grunts, as he calls them, they call themselves. And the first thing he sees is, nobody. See, it's kind of funny because emotionally everybody wanted Willem Dafoe to get the Oscar, and they were all kind of insulted that that the bad guy was up for the Oscar, even though Tom Berenger actually largely carries a lot of this movie, just literally. But his character also is the only one who knows anything. It's kind of like if you've had that job, if you've been in that work environment, you know exactly kind of how he feels if you strip away his, sociopathy or psychopathy or whatever. It's kind of like, now I got to do this again because Joe Blow didn't show up, or I mean, kind of like, okay, and he's even got his brown noser who's constantly like, hey, Bob, and and that guy just you like hanging out with him, but he also gets on your nerves and he wears you down, right? So I don't know, I didn't want to necessarily just have this be not really a conversation about writing, but like I said, we kind of have to go through this with Platoon because it's so loaded and deeply layered. And they, same as Apocalypse Now, Oliver Stone, I think, really made a point to take one isolated incident that, may have happened here and amplify it here, because did he really have a commander who shot his other sergeant? Probably not. Did that kind of thing happen? Supposedly, pretty often, and yada, yada, yada. But he's the staff sergeant, he's in charge. He's the higher rank than Elias. And he sees Elias as kind of getting in his way. And so, but it's kind of, then they have to add the overt racism scene toward basically the very end. I think it's the only time in this particular movie where, the N word is used, but that pushed Barnes over the top. If it wasn't Junior, who's, the black activist Muslim guy, if it was one of the other guys doing this crap and he had said, something like a Polish slur or an Irish slur or something, would it have been as, the same thing? Would this guy still be the racist? It's, I don't know. That's again, that's more of a film analysis than, a writing thing, but they're tied together because, like I said, Oliver Stone is intentionally making this guy not just a hard ass like Captain Bligh, right? There's several versions of Mutiny on the Bounty. In some versions, Captain Bligh is more overtly racist, I think, like in the Mel Gibson one. And so by the 80s, like I said, that's become like a real hot button issue. Well, we'll make Captain Bligh he hates these primitives, so that now he's even worse than just a guy who'll whip you to death for, pointing out that he stole the cheese, So it's like, it's like that whole kind of hate crime is worse than a regular crime. Okay, but the end result was still like this person got, killed or whatever. So we're kind of splitting here again from a society point of view. You could argue that all day, but from a film point of view, we're starting to get into soapbox territory. We're starting to get into what used to be considered too preachy, but for some reason in Platoon, it totally worked. Everybody bought on board. Like I said, it made Sergeant Barnes into Darth Vader instead of, just this overtaxed guy trying to win an unwinnable war or whatever. Now the part, obviously, when he shoots the woman, it's kind of funny too, because most of I don't want to talk about the audience because every audience will take away their own kind of part of this. But when I was in college, I kind of re-examined Chris when I saw the movie in like a classroom setting and was forced to think about it, more analytically than just identifying with him or whatever as a young man. It was kind of funny because I noticed his murder definition. In the conversation, the captain says if there was an illegal killing and all that. That conversation makes very little sense because he just plays his hand and kind of unwittingly gives Barnes the go ahead to just frag Elias, right? Chris and the audience, we're not totally on board about Barnes being a murderer, though, when he shoots the woman, right? Like there's this distinction. It's only when, the hypocrite Barnes disobeys orders and breaks down the machine to shoot Elias, then Chris knows he's a liar. He knows he's a murderer because Elias is dead, even though technically it was the NVA bullets that actually kill Elias. Barnes just sort of shot him and left him for dead, which resulted in him getting left behind by the helicopters. Therefore, so technically is Barnes the murderer, even though he killed this other woman? It doesn't get called a murderer by anybody but Elias. Like there's kind of a weird, I think I'm just trying to say those scenes could have played out a little better. If you view them, like I said, more analytically, it's kind of like Chris stands there in kind of shock, like, oh, I can't believe this, just happened in front of me, even though he's already in shock because Bunny killed the family back in the hut. And it's all, it's all pretty graphic. It's not like Apocalypse Now where Clean just for whatever reason flips a switch and kills all the people on the boat. Or well, it's not just him, but mostly him with the the puppy and all that. But I think Oliver Stone's, it's the same scene revisited, right? Everybody, I think, kind of wanted to, say we wanted, and we've seen this in interviews with, I think, Lawrence Fishburne and others. We wanted our own little Miley massacre in the movie to, call attention to that, even though that was like, again, one isolated incident that was very publicized. And same with Casualties of War, which came out in the 90s, I think, or 89 maybe. Again, an isolated incident where there were court martials. I'm not, it's hard to, again, we don't want to minimize the horror of the actual war, but for movie purposes, is it more important to pump up as much of this drama or, make everybody feel kind of yucky at the end? Or would a movie that was a little more maybe accurate to, how it might have played out, will that just be a more boring movie? Like I said, I can't really answer that question for you. Obviously, Oliver Stone doesn't care. He made the movie he wanted to make. When the studios all turned him down, and I wonder if this is part of the reason why, though. Like, okay, what's the motivation here? Why is this? What would military really be doing here? I don't know. They had military advisors on the film and all that. But again, I don't believe he necessarily had a sergeant who shot his other sergeant, who were both his Oedipal fathers from a Jim Morrison song or something. Anyway, so yeah, it's kind of like I said, I didn't really know how to approach this video, so I put it off for a while. But I figured I'd just get it out there. So yeah, Elias dying, I don't think we'll get Barnes a murder one conviction of an enlisted man for that. I don't know. Again, the military advisors could fill us in, and we could have a whole separate documentary to the movie 40 years later, right? That nobody would watch. The point is, like I said, all this operatic melodrama could happen in a real war, and Oliver Stone was there, and you weren't. So the prevalent mentality is, well, how dare you criticize this dramatic decision? Well, here I am criticizing it. Take it for what it's worth. Because in a sense, I mean, like I said, Oliver Stone's not going to deny that this is left-wing propaganda through melodrama, right? And which is kind of funny because and flip it politically now, most of the Southern guys then were Democrats in those days, but Nixon was running for office already this year. I don't know how many of them would have voted for him. Again, the characters aren't discussing who's in office, who's Nixon, who's LBJ. who was still the main contender at this point, because he doesn't resign until after Tet, which takes place about a month after this movie ends. So we're right on that cusp, like I said, Christmas 1967 to early 1968, and then the Tet Offensive is late January, which is, of course, when Full Metal Jacket takes place. And then we have we could compare those two movies if we really wanted to. But Full Metal Jacket, of course, everybody knows the first half in the boot camp is the important part of the movie, and then the second half is kind of hit or miss. But they do get very deep again into race relations and other issues in that movie. But just staying with this one, also Oliver Stone is not going to condemn his bunker buddies. None of these dope heads are actually crappy soldiers like the machine breaks down, because obviously when Elias fights him, it's on a personal level. You did this horrible thing. You don't have the right to do that thing. It wasn't, about but then Barnes tries to turn it around like, well, Elias is a bad soldier because he opposed me. It was like, well, no, okay, we can see you're lying. That wasn't the reason he opposed you, because he didn't want to follow orders. If your orders were to line up all these people and shoot them, of course he would have disobeyed that order. So now we're back to mutiny on the bounty, right? Sort of. But then you have other people have already gone deep into criticisms or commentaries of these things, so I don't want to restate everything that's already been said 30 years ago, in these academic things. But like they've talked, a lot about how Francis is Taylor's mirror, except Francis is, a deserter or a coward or whatever. And they mistakenly introduced Francis saying he's the new guy. But actually, if you watch through the footage, Francis is actually there before Taylor, or comes in only right after, maybe. I forget if Francis is there on the first ambush. I had written all this out, and I don't know where it went. I had a page of the list of all the soldiers trying to figure out which scenes, but most of them die in the ambush with the artillery barrage. That's just a really long kind of sequence. It's the same time when Elias dies. And the ones who died before that were mostly in the scene prior to the village, right? Because Sandy and Sal and Manny all die right before the village. And then right after the village, they have the big battle with the rockets and I don't know if Big Harold dies, but Big Harold gets hit by the satchel charge. Warren gets shot. Tubbs and Morehouse or whoever, the shell falls on their machine gun. So that's just a total, crap show, and 15 guys are knocked out in one scene, right? Crawford gets hit right before Elias gets shot. So Crawford's not dead, but Johnny Depp also, we don't know if he dies. Johnny Depp gets hit first, Lerner. Johnny Depp, Crawford, Warren, Big Harold, Tubbs, Morehouse, Sandy, Sal, Manny. I mean, we're literally almost at 10 people right now knocked out of the cast in about 20 or 30 minutes. Like I said, there's more. But then Sandy, of course, being Red's buddy. So when Red isn't, brown nosing up to Barnes, he's hanging out with Sandy a bit. So now he's kind of isolated a little bit more. And so that kind of goes to your dynamics, who are your buddy structures, this and that. It's kind of weird when you have like all this kind of cast to work with, and then it drops off. But that also kind of makes it easy because you can narrow in on who's still important. King talking to Taylor, Raw, now suddenly a main character who was just kind of there before in the background, that kind of thing. But not people who we hadn't, we're not just throwing new characters all into the mix, though. But then of course Junior. I started talking about Junior. And then kind of left off because obviously Junior is pervasive, and Junior and Bunny both die at the same time at the end. But it's kind of funny how, you know, these two supposedly opposites or whatever are the two that kind of pal around, you know. But you know, you get a sense of kind of like how Junior is allowed to spout all the racism he wants, and that's not racism. Why am I here fighting in this white man's war for these chucks? And it's like, well, the war is not actually a white man's war. It's actually the North Vietnamese communists versus the South Vietnamese Catholics. But, you know, forget all that for now, and let's just go with the you know, like I said, Oliver Stone doesn't give us all the context. He just gives you the character as he is. So you know, again, you can take that as you will. How much you have to know about the 60s and this and that to get through half the film, I don't know. Because like I said, when I'm in a classroom with a bunch of 19-year-olds who don't know anything about history or anything at all, and you just show them this movie, they're all traumatized, you know, and they're taking it as face value that every Southern American sergeant was running around killing everybody, you know. It becomes a mess. I don't know. Like I said, but so Raw, you know, and you know, you know, you're not going to get that even from Junior, although the other soldier says it to him, you know, hey, these, you know, they're kind of discussing it, and Junior says, well, you know, a Christian doesn't go around cutting off people's heads. So even he in his mind knows that there's kind of something wrong with the communists. But at the same time, it doesn't change his situation. So he's still pissed off that he has to just be there, you know, and he couldn't care less. None of these Vietnamese are, you know, considered bad for killing plenty of Americans, you know, including technically Elias, right? You know, so you get kind of this schism that maybe is accurate in the fog of war, you know. Like I said, they had a head start, you know, they had a leg up because he was already wounded. But then Raw comes in, and he's kind of like the voice, you know, the sort of the voice of reason. But mostly we only see him argue with the lieutenant when he's apparently been promoted suddenly. You know, there's still 3 or 4 squad leaders left now. Like I said, Warren is gone from the ambush. Elias is dead from the day before. So we still have Barnes, O'Neill, and maybe somebody else besides Raw, because Sandy got blown up prior to the village. And if King had any seniority, it doesn't matter because now he's flying home. Because I think King might have been one of the ones who they would have promoted to squad leader, but he just got his orders. Well, the man made a mistake in my favor. Who knew, you know? And so, yeah, they're waiting and holding out for replacements, and that's, you know, significant that they don't have enough guys, and they have no idea how much worse conditions will really be in another couple weeks when Tet breaks out. So their morale is low. They're all complaining that, you know, that none of that is, you know, faulty writing or whatever. It's actually, you know, kind of what makes the end of the movie kind of work. But of course, then the end of the movie is, you know, Chris Taylor's going to become the avenging angel or whatever. And then, of course, all the criticism back at the time by, again, all the left-leaning liberal people was like, well, Chris becomes the murderer, same as Barnes when he murders Barnes, and this whole, you know, psychological thing. Again, like I said, it sold plenty of movie tickets, so I don't know if I can fault it, but typically the writing, you know, advice would be to find a way to make that work without it being so preachy or controversial, I guess. You know, is Chris, because now Chris is the anti-hero, right? Instead of the hero, if there's a hero, like, you know, he's avenging Elias, who, again, the line just 2 scenes before is, you know, Elias didn't ask you to fight his battles, but here he is fighting Elias's battle, right? But it's also the battle for his own soul in the voiceover. Now, of course, in the movie adaptation, the characters in the Nicolas Cage goes to the writing seminar, and the guy says, never use voiceover, it's lazy and sloppy. Well, here I think we have an example of a film where the voiceover is not pervasive, and it does explain Chris's psychology during a lot of these kind of montage sequences or kind of dead time, like where we're in between heavy dramatic parts, right? We've had the excuse me, we've had the intro when we first land and we see the soldiers going on this ambush, or not the ambush, they're just kind of on a hike, whatever. Nobody dies. He kind of gets his respect for Barnes. Then the ambush comes in the next day, and there's kind of a little dramatic scene before that where Elias argues with Barnes. So we already see there's a conflict there again. And Barnes is trying to frame Elias, and Red is there. No, buddy, you got the fresh meat. And Elias is like, hey, take a break. And Barnes is already like, oh, this guy's just not a good soldier. He just doesn't want to do what he's told. It's like, well, that's because you give him all the crap. You never give this guy a break either. You think you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, but you are more than content to throw it onto his. But at the same time, Barnes tries to be fair to a degree because, like I said, every time Brown Noser guy comes to him, he says, no, Red, you go out. Your short timers stay here, but you go out. I need veterans. And so, again, to a point, until Oliver Stone, takes it to DEFCON 6, Barnes is more or less just doing the job the best he knows how. And he's effective at it as far as we can mostly tell. And then Elias says, oh, well, that guy died because he didn't have time to learn anything. It's like, well, that might be true, but what else was he going to learn except on-the-job training, which is kind of what, Vietnam was. Unfortunately, it was like the first part of the war before the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong was just booby traps everywhere, You didn't know where they were. You didn't see them, but the casualty rate was horrendous for the Americans, And so I think, like I said, I think that some of that context got kind of lost. Not totally, because now when we see the war, it's in this shifting position where the Viet Cong aren't really the main opponent anymore. The North Vietnamese army is really going on the offensive, and that's not very necessarily explained either at all. They don't ever think they even say the word Viet Cong in the entire thing until they get to the village. You're VC, meaning they're conspirators. And saboteurs or whatever, and that's never proven. But we know that the VC was an actual thing. But we also know that the reason all those weapons were stockpiled there was because they believed that the peasants would join them in their uprising. And of course, that never happened. Most of the peasants were like, no, we didn't want this stuff here in the first place. We're not going to use it against the Americans or the South Vietnamese government. So, if you wanted to make Platoon into a 6-hour movie, you easily could, because you could have, clips of journalists and, all this kind of conversations in the background, and then cut to these guys in the jungle trying to figure out, why are these holes here? Like, what's in this hole? See you next Tuesday, that kind of thing. So, it's a fine line, because again, Oliver Stone wants to show, his story more than he wants to show like the story. And typically I say, don't try to tell the whole story. Tell a good story. So again, how much a Platoon works, how much of it in hindsight is kind of like, okay, you're just kind of beating us over the head with your little, philosophy or whatever, agenda. So it's, like I said, if the movie had failed, I think, but a lot of sentiment from people who were already going to agree with the movie, even if they found it hard to sit through the movie because it was so, oh my God, heart-wrenching or whatever, Whereas again, like I said, the other half of the people were just popcorn and they laughed at the jokes. And it was kind of funny because when the movie came out, it was one of the few movies I was allowed into when I was underage. A lot of times they would say, no, you're too young, and they wouldn't let me in. But I actually saw Platoon like by myself on a Saturday matinee where like it was dead silent. Everybody was like, I'm not joking. And then like the following week, I saw it on date night on a Friday. I remember this vividly. And it was like guys with their girlfriends and stuff. They're eating popcorn. Chris falls over and they all laugh. Everybody was kind of like, they didn't leave the theater feeling all morose or any. It was kind of like, oh, that was a good movie, like just in a not in an enjoyable sense necessarily, but just like in a satisfying, like, okay, I saw something there that wasn't just car chase and, dick jokes or some, gratuitous breasts or whatever a lot of the comedies were at the time. So it was kind of a funny, but again, not necessarily the exact same response as Top Gun got, but there was a lot of curiosity because Vietnam was a thing that had wall to wall coverage for 10 years and then went away instantly. Like Disco was out, then Star Wars was out. And like I said, until like Apocalypse Now or whatever came out, the only other Vietnam movie really was the one I didn't mention at the beginning, Green Berets, 1968, right? John Wayne saves the world. And that movie, though, I mean, that movie's long and tedious, and everybody, lambasted it even at the time, how hokey it was and this and that and this and that. But, would it be worth doing it? But that movie, it had a bit more of the political mission embedded in it too, where, the justifications for this and that and this and that. And these were Kennedy's troops, the special forces, literally called the special forces, whereas Platoon, we're not getting the special forces, we're getting the grunts, so it's not necessarily the same, like I said, and same with Born on the 4th of July. Chris Taylor, his motivation and Ron Kovic motivation is not the same exact reason for going there in the first place. So again, like I said, we're not really discussing character much, but you do have to know your character clearly. And so it's kind of, Oliver Stone didn't write necessarily that book, but he was able to still understand that character to make Born on the 4th of July. And I think he was mostly faithful to the book, though, whereas, a lot of adaptations, they kind of go, oh, yeah, great story, and then just kind of make up their own. There's a couple scenes in it that weren't in the book, so I don't know if they really happened. But overall, yeah, the movie is actually easier to understand than the book was, because the book is kind of like he jumps around a lot in flashbacks and kind of his own kind of scattered kind of diary entries. And so I read the book, I think before I saw the whole movie, or I forget. But I know I had read the book at some point, and I was like, why is this considered? And then I saw the movie, and I was like, okay, that was really well done. Now I understood the parts of the book that was kind of like, turn it upside down and see if it's in the same language or something. I don't remember. This has been a long one, and I don't know if I accomplished everything, but as always, if anybody got this far, you can leave questions in the comments and go from there.